The year was 1339, and the small Swiss Confederation faced annihilation. An overwhelming force of approximately 20,000 mounted knights and infantry, the flower of Burgundian and Austrian nobility, clad in the finest armor that European metallurgy could produce, advanced toward the town of Laupen. Standing in their way was a vastly outnumbered Swiss force with a core contingent of roughly 800 pikemen from Bern and its allies. What transpired would shatter the prevailing assumptions about medieval warfare and mark the beginning of Swiss military supremacy that would dominate European battlefields for the next 2 centuries. This is not merely the story of a single battle, but of how disciplined infantry armed with simple pole weapons revolutionized warfare, broke the centuries-old dominance of armored cavalry, and established principles of military organization that echo through military history to the present day. The world before Laupen. The Age of Mounted Knights. To understand the magnitude of what occurred at Laupen, we must first grasp the military paradigm that had dominated European warfare for centuries. Since the collapse of the Roman Empire and the rise of feudalism, the mounted knight represented the apex of military power. These warriors were not merely soldiers, they were the embodiment of political, economic, and social authority. A fully equipped knight of the 14th century was a formidable fighting machine. Encased in plate armor that could weigh 50 to 60 pounds, mounted on a specially bred war horse that itself often wore protective barding, and armed with lance, sword, and mace, a charging knight possessed tremendous shock power. The stirrup, adopted in Europe during the 8th century, had transformed cavalry from mobile skirmishers into devastating shock troops capable of delivering the combined momentum of horse and rider in a single crushing impact. The training required to become an effective knight began in childhood and continued throughout a warrior's life. Knights practiced horsemanship, weapons handling, and the complex choreography of mounted combat from their earliest years. The investment in a knight's equipment, training, and maintenance of horses represented a substantial fortune, equivalent to the annual income of several peasant families. This combination of military effectiveness and enormous investment cost created a self-reinforcing military aristocracy. Those who could afford to fight as knights accumulated wealth and power through conquest and feudal obligation, which they then used to maintain their military edge. Infantry, by contrast, were typically poorly trained peasant levies, pressed into service and equipped with whatever weapons came to hand. They were expected to support the knights, not challenge them. Battle tactics reflected this hierarchy. Knights would typically deliver the decisive blow in combat, charging in formation to break enemy formations through sheer momentum. Infantry served to hold ground, pursue fleeing enemies, or besiege fortifications, supporting roles in what was fundamentally a cavalry-dominated system. Yet this system contained inherent vulnerabilities that few had recognized. Knights were expensive, meaning that even wealthy lords could field only limited numbers. Their effectiveness depended on terrain suitable for cavalry charges. And perhaps most importantly, the individualistic culture of knighthood, where personal glory and honor drove behavior, often undermined tactical coordination. The Swiss, forged by geography and necessity. The Swiss Confederation that emerged in the early 14th century was born from unique geographical and political circumstances. The alpine valleys and mountain passes of central Switzerland created communities that were isolated yet strategically important, poor in resources yet rich in determination. Unlike the flat plains of France or the rolling hills of England where cavalry reigned supreme, Swiss terrain favored defenders. Narrow valleys, steep slopes, and forested mountainsides made traditional cavalry charges difficult or impossible. The Swiss had learned through necessity to fight on foot in close formation, using the terrain to their advantage. The founding of the Swiss Confederation in 1291 was itself an act of military defiance. When the communities of Uri, Schwitz, and Unterwalden formed their alliance, they were explicitly rejecting the feudal authority of the Habsburg dynasty. This was revolutionary, commoners declaring independence from their noble overlords. It could only be sustained through military success. The Swiss military system evolved to match their political structure. Rather than relying on a feudal levy where knights provided military service in exchange for land grants, the Swiss developed a citizen militia system. Every able-bodied man was expected to own weapons and train regularly. This created a pool of soldiers who were not professional warriors, but who possessed far greater training and cohesion than typical peasant levies. The weapon that would define Swiss warfare was already emerging: the pike. In its developed form, the Swiss pike was a formidable weapon, a wooden shaft 10 to 18 feet in length, tipped with a steel spearhead. It was simple to manufacture, relatively inexpensive, and required less individual skill than knightly weapons. But in the hands of trained, disciplined formations, it became devastating. The pike's length gave it reach advantages over cavalry lances and allowed infantry to strike mounted warriors before they could close to sword range. When deployed in dense formation, with the front ranks kneeling and rear ranks standing, pikes created a bristling wall of steel points that horses would refuse to charge. This defensive capability was well understood. What the Swiss would pioneer was using pike formations offensively, transforming a defensive weapon into a tool of aggressive tactical maneuver. By 1339, the Swiss had already demonstrated their fighting prowess in several smaller engagements. The Battle of Morgarten in 1315, where Swiss forces ambushed and destroyed an Austrian army in a mountain pass, had shown that Swiss infantry could defeat noble cavalry under the right circumstances. But Morgarten had been a guerrilla action, an ambush in ideal terrain. Laupen would be different, an open field battle where Swiss tactics would be tested against overwhelming numbers in a conventional engagement. The road to Laupen. Politics and provocation. The immediate cause of the Battle of Laupen lay in the complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized 14th-century European politics. Bern, a rising power within the Swiss Confederation, had been expanding its influence and territory, bringing it into conflict with surrounding powers. The town of Laupen, located on the Sens River approximately 15 kilometers southwest of Bern, had recently placed itself under Bernese protection. This enraged the surrounding nobility, particularly the Counts of Burgundy and various Habsburg allies, who saw Bern's expansion as a direct threat to their own territorial ambitions. An coalition formed against Bern, bringing together an impressive array of forces. The core of the army consisted of Burgundian and Savoyard nobility, reinforced by contingents from various smaller lords. This was a feudal host in the classic style, multiple contingents under their own banners, each composed primarily of mounted knights supported by infantry. Contemporary chronicles vary in their estimates of the coalition's size, with some claiming forces as large as 25,000 to 30,000 men. Modern historians tend toward more conservative estimates, but even accepting figures of 15,000 to 20,000 soldiers, the coalition force outnumbered the Swiss by a factor of at least 5 to 1, and possibly much more. The Swiss force that marched to relieve Laupen in June 1339 was significantly smaller, probably numbering between 5,000 and 6,000 men total. Of these, the elite corps consisted of approximately 800 to 1,000 pikemen from Bern and closely allied communities. These were the men who would decide the battle, experienced soldiers who had trained together and who trusted their commanders and each other. The Swiss commander was Rudolf von Erlach, a Bernese nobleman who had embraced the Swiss tactical system. His leadership would prove crucial, not through brilliant tactical innovations, but through the discipline and coordination he maintained in the face of overwhelming odds. The pike. Technology and technique. Before examining the battle itself, we must understand the weapon system that made Swiss success possible. The pike seems simple, just a long spear, but its effective use required sophisticated tactical doctrine and intensive training. The pike's length was its primary advantage. While a cavalry lance might extend 8 to 10 feet, Swiss pikes reached 14 to 18 feet, giving infantry a reach advantage even against mounted opponents. This length came with trade-offs. Pikes were unwieldy in individual combat and required both hands to wield effectively, leaving soldiers without shields for protection. The solution was formation fighting. Swiss pike formations, typically arrayed in dense rectangular blocks called battles or squares, with files, ranks from front to back, of 10 to 20 men deep. The front ranks extended their pikes forward, creating a hedge of steel points. Rear ranks held their pikes at steeper angles, providing depth and allowing them to step forward as front-rank soldiers fell. This formation doctrine represented a radical departure from typical infantry tactics. Most medieval infantry fought in loose formations where individual combat skills mattered more than unit cohesion. Swiss pike squares, by contrast, fought as single organisms. Individual skill mattered less than maintaining formation and responding to commands in unison. The effectiveness of pike squares depended absolutely on discipline and training. A gap in the formation could allow cavalry to penetrate, and once cavalry broke into the interior of a pike square, the long weapons became liabilities. Soldiers had to maintain their positions even as armored knights thundered toward them, a level of nerve that could only be achieved through training and trust in one's companions. The Swiss developed elaborate training regimens to build this discipline. Militia companies drilled regularly, practicing formation maneuvers, pike handling, and responses to various tactical situations. Soldiers learned to dress ranks, align the formation, wheel, turn as a unit, and advance or retreat in formation without losing cohesion. Perhaps most innovative was the Swiss approach to offensive tactics. While earlier pike formations had been primarily defensive, designed to hold ground against cavalry, the Swiss trained their pike squares to maneuver aggressively. A Swiss pike square could advance steadily, maintaining formation even while moving across uneven ground. This transformed the pike from a defensive weapon into an offensive tool capable of tactical maneuver. Supporting the pikemen were soldiers armed with halberds, pole weapons combining an axe blade with a spike and hook. Halberdiers could strike over or around pike points, and their weapons were more effective in close combat once formations became intermixed. The Swiss typically deployed halberdiers on the flanks or in the rear ranks of their formations, where they could exploit opportunities created by the pikes. The Battle of Lopen. Morning deployments. On June 21, 1339, the two armies confronted each other near Lopen. The battlefield was relatively open, though broken by gentle hills and the Sens River, which constrained movement on one flank. This terrain offered no particular advantage to either side. Neither the mountain passes that had favored the Swiss at Morgarten, nor the completely flat plains, ideal for cavalry charges. The coalition army deployed in traditional feudal fashion. Multiple contingents of cavalry formed under their respective banners, with infantry in supporting positions. The exact deployment is debated by historians, but the general arrangement placed heavy cavalry in the center and wings, positioned to deliver the decisive charge that had dominated European warfare for centuries. The sheer size of the coalition army created its own problems. Coordinating multiple contingents, each under its own commander and each jealous of its honor and precedence, was always challenging in medieval warfare. The coalition leadership apparently planned a relatively straightforward battle, use their massive numerical superiority to envelope and crush the smaller Swiss force through coordinated cavalry charges. The Swiss deployment showed Rudolf von Erlach's tactical acumen. He formed his army into 3 pike squares, or battles, with the smallest, approximately 800 men, mostly Bernese pikemen, in the center under his personal command. Larger formations of allied Swiss troops held the flanks. This deployment created mutual support between the 3 formations while allowing each to maneuver independently. Von Erlach's positioning was crucial. By placing his most reliable troops in the center, he ensured that the point most likely to receive the heaviest cavalry assault would hold firm. The flank formations, while larger, had the advantage of being able to maneuver and support the center if it came under excessive pressure. The Swiss also demonstrated their understanding of combined arms warfare. While the pike squares formed the core of their formation, they deployed crossbowmen and other missile troops in forward positions to harass the enemy and disrupt cavalry formations before they could charge home. The storm breaks. Initial cavalry assault. The battle opened with the coalition cavalry advancing toward the Swiss positions. Contemporary accounts describe the sight as terrifying. Thousands of armored horsemen advancing in waves, banners flying, the thunder of hooves shaking the ground. For the Swiss pikemen standing in formation, this must have been a supreme test of nerve. The first cavalry charge struck the Swiss center, where von Erlach's 800 Bernese pikemen stood firm. This moment would determine everything. If the pike square broke, the battle would become a rout and massacre. If it held, the Swiss would have a chance. The pikemen held. As cavalry approached, the front ranks leveled their pikes, creating a barrier of steel points extending 15 to 18 feet forward. Horses, no matter how well trained, will not charge into a solid wall of spears. The cavalry charge slowed, then stopped just short of contact, horses wheeling and rearing as knights attempted to find a way through the pike hedge. This was the critical moment where pike formations proved their worth. Unable to break through by momentum alone, the cavalry became vulnerable. Knights attempting to force their way through the pike points exposed themselves and their horses to repeated thrusts. The length of the Swiss pikes meant that even mounted knights, with their height advantage, could be struck before they could bring their own weapons to bear. The coalition forces continued their assault, launching multiple cavalry charges against different points in the Swiss line. The pattern repeated. Cavalry approached, were stopped by the pike hedge, attempted to force a breakthrough, and were repulsed with casualties. The Swiss formations held, maintaining their cohesion even under tremendous pressure. But holding defensive positions was not the Swiss plan. Von Erlach understood that merely surviving the cavalry charges would not win the battle. Outnumbered as severely as they were, the Swiss had to seize the initiative or eventually be worn down and destroyed. The Swiss counterattack. Tactical revolution. What happened next transformed medieval warfare. Rather than remaining in defensive positions, von Erlach ordered his pike squares to advance. This was revolutionary. Infantry formations attacking cavalry rather than simply holding ground and hoping to survive. The advance of a Swiss pike square was a fearsome sight. The formation moved forward steadily, maintaining alignment, the forest of pike points extending forward. Any cavalry that attempted to charge the advancing square met the same impenetrable pike hedge. But now the Swiss were dictating the tempo of battle, choosing where and when to engage. The tactical genius of this maneuver lay in its psychological and physical effects on the enemy. Cavalry expected infantry to stand on the defensive, waiting to receive charges. The sight of infantry formations aggressively advancing upset the normal tactical assumptions. Knights who had been preparing to charge suddenly found themselves the targets of attack, forced to react rather than act. The three Swiss pike squares advanced in coordination, maintaining their mutual support while each formation remained compact and disciplined. This prevented the coalition cavalry from isolating any single Swiss formation and destroying it in detail. If cavalry concentrated against one Swiss square, the other two could maneuver to strike the cavalry from the flank or rear. The advancing pike squares began to drive wedges through the coalition formation. Unable to stop the Swiss advance through frontal cavalry charges, the coalition army's cohesion began to break down. Different contingents attempted different responses. Some cavalry tried to circle around to attack the Swiss from the flanks or rear, while others dismounted to fight on foot where the Swiss pike advantage would be reduced. These improvised responses lacked coordination. The coalition army, for all its size and power, was a feudal host of multiple semi-independent contingents. There was no unified command structure capable of rapidly coordinating a response to the unexpected Swiss tactics. Individual lords made decisions for their own contingents, often based on personal honor rather than tactical necessity. The battle reaches its climax. As the Swiss pike squares continued their advance, the battle evolved into a series of desperate combats across the battlefield. Some coalition cavalry, frustrated by their inability to break the pike formations from the front, attempted to attack the Swiss formations from the rear. This was when the depth of the Swiss formations proved crucial. A pike square 20 ranks deep could reverse its front ranks relatively quickly, turning to face a new threat while maintaining formation integrity. The rear ranks would about-face, extending their pikes toward the new threat, while the previously front ranks provided depth and support. This flexibility allowed Swiss formations to respond to threats from multiple directions without losing the cohesion that was their primary advantage. The coalition infantry, which had been held in reserve during the initial cavalry charges, now moved forward to engage the Swiss directly. Here the battle became a grinding melee of infantry against infantry, pike against spear and sword. The Swiss maintained their tight formations, using their pike's length advantage and their superior coordination to push back the less disciplined coalition infantry. Individual acts of courage and desperation occurred throughout the battlefield. Knights, frustrated by their inability to break the Swiss formations, dismounted to fight on foot. Some attempted to grab Swiss pikes and pull them aside, creating gaps in the formation. The Swiss responded by drawing swords and halberds for close combat, while maintaining enough pike points forward to prevent cavalry from exploiting any brief gaps. The turning point came when one of the Swiss flank formations succeeded in breaking through a section of the coalition line. This created a cascade effect. As one part of the coalition army began to retreat, panic spread to adjacent units. The carefully maintained formation of cavalry and infantry began to fragment as different contingents made independent decisions about whether to continue fighting or withdraw. Von Erlach recognized the moment and pressed his advantage. The Swiss squares continued their advance, now driving into a fragmenting enemy army. What had begun as a defensive battle had become a rout. Coalition forces, unable to coordinate an effective response and seeing parts of their army already in flight, began a general retreat. The pursuit and aftermath. Medieval battles were often decided not in the initial combat, but in the pursuit that followed. Once an army broke and ran, it became vulnerable to catastrophic casualties as organized formations dissolved into fleeing individuals. The Swiss pursuit was methodical and devastating. The discipline that had held the pike squares together during the battle now made the Swiss effective pursuers. Rather than breaking formation to chase individual enemies, which would have made them vulnerable to counterattack, the Swiss advanced in formation, cutting down any coalition forces that attempted to rally or hold position, coalition casualties were severe. Contemporary chronicles claim thousands killed, though exact figures are impossible to verify. What is clear is that the coalition army was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. The fleeing remnants dispersed to their home territories, and no attempt was made to gather a new army to challenge Bern in the immediate aftermath. Swiss casualties, by contrast, were remarkably light given the disparity in numbers. The pike formations had proven devastatingly effective at keeping enemy cavalry at a distance, resulting in far fewer Swiss casualties than would be expected in a conventional medieval battle. This favorable casualty ratio would become characteristic of Swiss victories throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. Analyzing the impossible. How 800 beat 20,000? The Battle of Laupen demands explanation. How could such a grossly outnumbered force not only survive, but achieve a decisive victory? The answer lies in multiple interlocking factors that combined to overcome the coalition's numerical superiority. Tactical innovation. The Swiss use of pike squares as offensive, maneuvering formations represented genuine military innovation. Previous pike formations had been essentially static, designed to hold ground. The Swiss transformed them into mobile tactical units capable of advancing, turning, and coordinating complex maneuvers while maintaining the defensive strength of the pike hedge. Discipline and training. The Swiss militia system produced soldiers who, while not full-time professionals, trained regularly and fought alongside their neighbors and fellow citizens. This created unit cohesion and mutual trust that far exceeded typical peasant levies. When cavalry charged, Swiss pikemen held their ground because they trusted their comrades to hold as well. Unified command. Rudolf von Erlach commanded the entire Swiss force with a unified tactical plan. The coalition army, by contrast, consisted of multiple contingents, each under its own noble commander. When the battle plan, essentially charge and overwhelm them, failed to work, there was no mechanism for rapid tactical adjustment. Terrain and deployment. While the battlefield was relatively open, it was not ideal cavalry terrain. The presence of the Sens River constrained maneuver, and gentle hills broke up the perfect sight lines that cavalry commanders preferred. Von Erlach's deployment in 3 mutually supporting formations made it impossible for the coalition to use its numbers to simply envelope the Swiss position. Psychological factors. The Swiss fought for their homes and their independence. The coalition fought for territorial expansion and feudal obligation. This difference in motivation translated into differences in determination and willingness to accept risk. Swiss pikemen held formation under cavalry charges because breaking meant death and defeat for their communities. Coalition cavalry, facing unexpected resistance, could choose to withdraw and preserve themselves for another day. Tactical mismatch. Medieval cavalry tactics were optimized for breaking infantry formations through shock, the combination of mass, momentum, and height advantage. Against disciplined pike squares, these advantages disappeared. Cavalry couldn't generate momentum against the pike hedge. Mass became a liability when horses crowded together, refusing to advance into the pikes, and the length of Swiss pikes negated the mounted height advantage. The coalition army's tactical doctrine had no effective answer to Swiss pike squares. The myth of numbers. The coalition's numerical superiority was less decisive than it appeared. In the confined frontage where the actual fighting occurred, only a fraction of the coalition army could engage at any given time. The rest waited in reserve, unable to bring their numbers to bear. The Swiss pike squares, by contrast, could bring their entire formation into action, maximizing their combat power relative to their size. The aftermath. Birth of the Swiss military reputation. The Battle of Laupen had immediate strategic consequences. Bern's position was secured, and the Swiss Confederation's independence was confirmed. But the longer-term impact was even more significant. Laupen established the Swiss as formidable military powers whose infantry could defeat the finest cavalry in Europe. Over the following decades, the Swiss would refine and perfect their tactical system. Pike squares became longer and more flexible, with elaborate training in maneuvers and formations. The Swiss developed methods for coordinating multiple pike squares, creating grand tactical formations that could maneuver on the battlefield while maintaining mutual support. The Swiss also monetized their military prowess. Swiss mercenaries became the most sought-after soldiers in Europe, serving in the armies of France, Italy, and other powers. Kings and princes competed to hire Swiss pike companies, knowing that these disciplined, effective infantry could be decisive in battle. The tactical lessons of Laupen spread slowly but inexorably through European military thought. Other nations attempted to replicate Swiss success, creating their own pike formations and drilling infantry in Swiss-style tactics. The Landsknechts of the Holy Roman Empire and the Spanish tercios both drew direct inspiration from Swiss methods. The dominance of armored cavalry, which had characterized European warfare for centuries, was broken. While cavalry remained important, they could no longer dominate battlefields against well-trained, well-disciplined infantry. This had profound social and political implications, undermining the military basis of the feudal aristocracy. Technical and tactical legacy. The Swiss tactical system that emerged from Laupen influenced military thinking for centuries. The emphasis on formation, discipline, and drill became fundamental to European military doctrine. The transition from feudal levies to professional standing armies owed much to the Swiss model of organized, trained infantry. The pike itself remained a dominant battlefield weapon until the late 16th century, when improvements in firearms finally made pike formations obsolete. Even then, pike and shot formations, combining pikemen with musketeers, drew directly on Swiss tactical innovations. The pikemen provided a mobile defensive shield that protected musketeers as they reloaded, while the firearms provided the striking power that pikes alone lacked. Modern military analysts have drawn parallels between Swiss pike squares and later infantry formations. The emphasis on maintaining formation under fire, the importance of unit cohesion and discipline, and the principle that well-trained infantry can defeat more expensive, individually superior forces all echo through military history to the present day. Conclusion: when numbers don't matter. The Battle of Laupen stands as one of history's most dramatic demonstrations that numerical superiority does not guarantee victory. 800 Swiss pikemen, backed by several thousand allies, defeated an army that outnumbered them by factors of 5 to 1 or more. They achieved this through tactical innovation, superior discipline, unified command, and the courage to implement aggressive tactics against overwhelming odds. The battle marked a turning point not just in Swiss history, but in the evolution of European warfare. The centuries-old dominance of armored cavalry ended not through technological innovation — the pike was an ancient weapon — but through organizational and tactical revolution. The Swiss demonstrated that disciplined infantry, properly trained and well led, could defeat the flower of European chivalry. The legacy of Laupen extended far beyond the Swiss Confederation. The tactical principles demonstrated on that June day in 1339 influenced military doctrine for centuries. The emphasis on infantry formation, discipline, and drill became fundamental to European armies. The Swiss military reputation, forged at Laupen and confirmed in subsequent battles, made Swiss mercenaries the most sought-after soldiers in Europe for the next 200 years. In the broader sweep of military history, Laupen represents a recurring pattern. Determined defenders using innovative tactics can overcome seemingly impossible odds. The specific weapons and tactics change, but the underlying principles remain constant. Discipline defeats disorganization. Unity of command trumps numerical superiority. Innovation can overcome established tactical doctrines. And courage, combined with smart tactics, can achieve victories that seem impossible. The 800 Swiss pikemen who stood firm at Laupen could not have known they were revolutionizing warfare. They were simply fighting for their homes, their independence, and their lives. But in doing so, they created a military legacy that would echo through the centuries, proving that in warfare, how you fight often matters more than how many fight.